Good morning. History of St. Louis. It's been a while since you've heard my voice, and I am excited to introduce one of the last topics that we're going to go over, the famous families of St. Louis, and we're going to take a look at the Lemps and the Bushes. And so had we been in class, I would have started with this little lecture, which I have to legally disclaim I am not promoting, supporting, condoning, encouraging, recommending, enticing, or promoting the consumption of, drinking of, slamming of, bonging of, shotgunning of, sipping of, or any other form of intaking beer. I do not want you to drink beer until you're 21 or after that, but in order to understand this, you have to understand how to make beer and that it's been around literally almost as long as we've had civilized society. And it's a pretty simple ingredient list. You have water, you have a starch, usually it's barley or wheat. Lately, breweries have incorporated rice and corn. You have yeast, which ferments and that produces the alcohol. And then you have a little Brussels sprout looking thing called the hops, which gives the beer its flavor. You basically soak the beer in the hops, or you pour hops into the beer and let it soak, and that gives beer a distinctive taste to it. And so literally there are hundreds of varieties of hops that you can. When you take a look at beer, there are two types of beer. There's ale, which is more of like an English beer. Think of like Guinness. For those of you who've ever worked at a restaurant or have ever seen a Guinness port, it's a dark beer. If it's served properly, it's served at room temperature. It's not served cold. And it is a very dark, bitter beer. Then you have a German-style beer called lager, and that's what we are used to in St. Louis because the Germans brought beer to St. Louis. And lager is brewed and stored cold, and it is served cold. It is much lighter in color. It's sort of an amber gold look to it. People who drink ale would say that lager is watered down beer. It is less bitter. It's a lighter beer, and that is what we are used to. But all of the beers use the same four ingredients. All right, so let's take a look real quickly at the Lemp family. The whole story of the Lemp family in St. Louis starts with Johann Adam Lemp. He comes from Eschwig, Germany, and when he comes to St. Louis in 1838, he actually comes here to open up a grocery store. And at the grocery store, he happens to sell his homemade beer. And so this beer that he sells at his grocery store is extremely important historically. There is a debate among historians right now as to whether Johann Adam Lemp was the first to bring lager beer to the United States. It is looking more and more like he was. It's between him and a gentleman in Philadelphia as to who brought lager beer to the United States first, and it looks like that Johann Adam Lemp was the first to do that in the United States. So there's another little claim to fame for St. Louis history. Eventually, he's going to abandon the grocery business and just focus on the beer. And for him and his family, that's going to be a very important and sizable decision. And so, as I said before, this beer that he starts to brew is the first lager in St. Louis, that is for sure, and most probably it is the first lager beer in the United States. And so when he dies in 1862, he is worth about $20,000, which would be the equivalent today of right around $800,000. So he's just short of being a millionaire in 1862, and that just shows you how quickly that beer business grew. This is his gravesite. He is buried in Bell Fountain Cemetery. The other Lemps are buried there as well, but they are buried in the mausoleum that we studied. He is buried by himself and his wife in this gravesite. So then we switch to this gentleman right here, William Lemp Sr. He is the eldest son of Johann Adam Lemp, and he will take over the business after his dad dies. His huge claim to fame for the Lemp Brewery is that in 1866, he's going to buy land on Cherokee Street, basically in Soulard. And he's going to move his dad's brewery, which was located at the southern leg of the arch today. So if you're looking at the arch from downtown, it's the right-handed leg where the Lemp grocery store and then later the brewery was. But they needed to expand and make a much bigger brewery. So William Lemp Sr. is going to buy 5 blocks of this area in Soulard and turn it into the Lemp Brewery. And that is where the Lemp Brewery is today. And so it is a huge, huge facility. He will also at the time buy his father-in-law's house, which was right down the street from the brewery. It was called the Fikert Mansion at the time, and now it is most famously known as the Lemp Mansion. And he gets that mansion because of his wife, Julia Fikert. And the Fikert family was a business family in St. Louis. And when William Lemp Sr. buys the Lemp Mansion, he initially turns it into his office, since it's right down the street from the Lemp Brewery. And then they convert the house into a home, and they expand it, and it becomes the family home as well as the office as well. By 1870, the Lemp Brewery in St. Louis is the largest brewery in St. Louis. In 1892, William Lemp Sr. changes the name of the brewery to the William J. Lemp Brewery. He names it after himself. And then he has a series of bad luck. First of all, his favorite son, right here in the upper right-hand corner, Frederick Lemp, the one that he wants to take over the business after he gets out. He is not the oldest son, but he is the favorite son. He's being groomed to take over the business. And he dies of some heart issues in 1901. Then 3 short years later, in 1904, William Lemp Sr. Has his best friend, a gentleman from Milwaukee named Gustav Pabst. If you've ever heard of Pabst Blue Ribbon, this is the guy who created that beer. He dies as well. And so the death of his favorite son and his best friend puts William Lemp Sr. into a major depression. And as a result of that, he goes into what is now an upstairs bedroom called the William Lemp Suite. And that was his office at the time, and he ends up becoming the first Lemp to commit suicide in that bedroom at the Lemp Mansion. And the other thing that you're going to need to know is that the beer made by the Lemps is called Falstaff. Falstaff was a Shakespearean character who liked to party, and so they thought, well, that's a perfect name for a beer, and so that's how they got the name Falstaff. The name Falstaff will be sold after the Lemps stop making the beer. They still make Falstaff today. It's not the same beer that the Lemps made, but the name has continued on. So after William Lemp Sr. dies, here is a look at the Lemp Mansion. Remember, this was known as the Fikert Mansion at the time, and then it was converted into the Lemp Mansion. William Lemp Sr. will have 9 children. Anna is the oldest, then William Lemp Jr., then Louis, then Charles, then Frederick, then I think it's Hilda, and then Edwin, and then Elsa. Where is the 9th child? There was an oldest son right up here. That son, it is believed today to have had some sort of mental or physical handicap, perhaps Down syndrome, or some likable handicap. And back then, it was sort of a social stigma to have a special needs child. And so they kept that child basically hidden and locked away from society because of that. And so nobody had ever seen, and the child ended up dying at a relatively young age. And by the way, supposedly haunts the Lemp Mansion as well. But that is the 9th child that is not listed here. This is the Lemp Cave. So why did the Lemps and the Bushes and basically every other brewer move to the Soulard area? because of the Cherokee cave system, and you need to jot this down in your notes. The Cherokee cave system is a cave system underneath Soulard. And the caves are important because when you make lager beer, you have to brew it and store it cold. And so what the caves do is it gives you a cold facility or place to store the beer. Naturally, caves are about 56 degrees, and then what they would do in the wintertime is pack the caves full of ice chunks from the Mississippi River. That would lower the temperature of the caves to near freezing 32 degrees, and therefore they basically created a giant refrigerator where they could keep the beer stored. And since it was constant at 32, the ice would take a long time to melt. So it was definitely something that attracted every brewer in the area to move into the Soulards, and the Lemps build their brewery on top of this cave system, and the house is also connected to the cave system, so they could literally walk downstairs into their house and join the cave system and then walk to where they worked. So it was a definite big facility. This is the Lemp Brewery today. This is the power plant, and you see the large smokestack right here. This provided power to the entire complex. This is where they would store the grain or barley, and you can see the silos here where they would store that. Then they would create the Lemp, and this is the brew house right here, and then this is the bottling plant and the packaging plant right here, and then they would ship it out, and these two are the main offices of the Lemp Brewery. So it is a huge facility today. Today it's been converted into, I know this area over here where the power plant is sort of a place where artists can work, and I do know that in the parking lot back here they have flea shops or flea markets in the summertime. They're trying to open this up as some office space as well. And then right here is Demonil Avenue, and if you go up the street, that's where the Lemp Mansion is. So the Lemp Mansion would be off camera right over here, and so this is sort of the Lemp Brewery area. The Lemp name is still on the buildings today. It's in tile, so it's not going anywhere. The logo has been altered because in Prohibition times you could not promote beer, and so the logo had to be taken down, and so that's why the logos are somewhat destroyed. And so after William Lemp Sr. commits suicide, William Lemp Jr., otherwise known as Billy, is going to take over operations basically in 1904. He is known not only for taking over the brewery, but having a very nasty public divorce with his wife Lillian, who was known in St. Louis as the Lavender Lady. That was because she always was seen wearing lavender when she went out. She either wore a lavender dress or a lavender hat. I've heard two reasons why this happened, either because it was her favorite color, and so she always wanted to go out wearing her favorite color, or I've heard also that it was his favorite color and that he made her go out and wear it when in public. And so I'm not sure which story is true, but I could believe both of them. After he divorced Lillian, he remarries and builds a new house basically in the Kirkwood Sunset Hills area called Allswell. I'm going to show you that house. It would be worth about $2.9 million today. And so he is unfortunately the Lemp that is in charge of the Lemp Brewery when the United States starts to enact Prohibition in 1919. Unlike the Bushes, the Lemps really don't try. They try to make a non-alcoholic beer. It just doesn't go very well. Unlike the Bushes, where the Bushes sold relatively well for a little bit. The Lemps tried to make a non-alcoholic beer, and it didn't go, and so they ended up losing everything shortly thereafter. So basically, after that didn't go very well, Billy had to sell the brewery. Now, what do you do with a brewery, or who was going to want to buy a brewery during Prohibition? And so that was the problem for the Lemps. At the time, the facility was worth well over $7 million, and they ended up selling it for $588,000, so less than a tenth of what it was worth. So imagine you having something worth $1,000 and you get literally $90 for it. That's about the same payoff. The International Shoe Company will buy the brewery and then convert the brewery into a shoe manufacturing plant. And so after this, he basically goes into a depression, and just before New Year's Eve, in December 29th of 1922, he goes to his office, which is the dining room on the left when you walk into the Lemp Mansion, and he locks the door and he shoots himself with the same type of gun that his dad did, and he becomes the second Lemp to commit suicide in the Lemp Mansion. This is a shot of the Lemp Brewery being dried out at the beginning of Prohibition. They're basically pouring everything down into the sewers. And here you can see them again tapping into the building and getting rid of the beer. Here in this photograph, you see them actually taking deliveries of alcohol and smashing them right on the side of the railroad. This is the Post-Dispatch headline the day after William Lemp commits suicide, or actually this is the afternoon edition. He had killed himself in the morning, and it was starting to be reported by the afternoon edition. Back then, newspapers had a morning edition, and then they had an afternoon edition. This was his home in the Kirkwood Sunset Hills area. This home overlooks the Merrimack River. This is what it looked like back in the day. It looked more like a German hunting lodge. It is a huge, huge house. You don't get a really good feel of just how large this is by the pictures, but this is a huge, huge house. And so this is a little bit about Lillian Hanlon Lemp. After she divorces William Lemp Jr., she goes on to live a pretty much secluded life. She lives in an apartment in the Central West End, and then she is buried in the Lemp Mausoleum next to her son, who was the only son between her and William Lemp Jr. And the only reason why she's buried in the mausoleum is because her son died before her, and she really wanted to be buried next to her son. And so this is Lillian Hanlon Lemp. She was only 4'10", and supposedly had an 18-inch waist, so she was a pretty petite woman. This is their only son, William Lemp III. His big thing is that after Prohibition ends, he tries to revive the Lemp Brewery and starts to get things going, and it looks like it's going to happen, and then he unfortunately dies of a heart attack 10 years after Prohibition ends in 1943, and this really puts any dash on the Lemp Brewery ever reopening again. The only other Lemp that survived and that has a story in this whole saga is Charles Lemp, the brother of Billy Lemp. When Billy Lemp auctioned off the brewery, the one thing that he was able to keep was the Lemp Mansion. And so after he shot himself, his brother Charles then takes over the house and lives in the house for a period of about 15 years or so. And then and his problem is that he suffered from probably what we would call OCD today, obsessive compulsive disorder. He was a germaphobe. He was a recluse. He did not let anybody into his house. He was basically quarantining himself like we do today, but because of more psychological reasons. And then he developed gout. Gout is a painful inflammation of the joints. Usually it starts in the foot and can go work its way up to the ankle and the knees and the hips, and it's just a very painful experience and makes it very difficult to walk. And so he actually had to move his bedroom in the Lemp Mansion from the second floor, which is where all the bedrooms are, to the first floor. And so today, if you go to the Lemp Mansion and the Lemp Restaurant, the bar area was the room that he converted into his bedroom. But the pain and the psychological distancing of everybody basically took his toll on himself. And on the right-hand side here, you see the only suicide letter written by any Lemp, and it says, "In case I am found dead, blame it on no one but me, Charles A. Lemp." And so before he kills himself, though, he ends up killing his Doberman Pinscher dog because he was afraid of being alone in the afterlife. And so he wanted his faithful dog to go with him. So he shot his dog first and then shot himself. And is said to he is supposedly another of the spirits, along with Billy Lemp and William Lemp Sr., that haunt the Lemp Mansion. This is a picture of the other Lemp that committed suicide. She is the only Lemp to commit suicide outside of the Lemp Mansion. This is Elsa Lemp Wright. She had a rocky marriage with her husband. They separated for a while and then got back together. They lived in the Central West End in this house, number 13, Horton's Place. And after a real bad morning, not only was she psychologically, I think, fragile from the rocky marriage, but she also had some gastrointestinal issues that I think was very painful for her. And one morning she woke up and just decided that she couldn't handle all of the pain and circumstances anymore, and she ended up shooting herself in the bathroom here. And so this is the only other place in St. Louis where a Lemp committed suicide that is not the Lemp Mansion. And so I'll let you read this a little bit. It goes on to talk about her suicide. The only Lemp that really had a long, productive life was the youngest son, Edwin Lemp. And he, from a very young age, decided, I'm going to have nothing to do with this brewery. I'm just going to live off the family fortune, but I am not going to have any connection with the Lemp Mansion or the Lemp Brewery because I think it's cursed. So he walked away from all of that. His major thing in St. Louis is that he tirelessly worked to build up and improve the St. Louis Zoo. He used a lot of his fortune to purchase animals and have them shipped here to St. Louis in order to furnish more animals for the St. Louis Zoo. When his brother Charles committed suicide, he then took over the property, and basically what he did is he went in and he burned all of the furniture and all of the records to sort of purge the Lemp curse from the Lemp family. And so that is why there's very little original furniture left in the Lemp Mansion. That is because Edwin basically destroyed it. He lived in an estate sort of next to his older brother Billy's estate. Billy's estate was named Allswell. Edwin built a house a little bit away from that in Kirkwood called Cragwald. It also overlooks the Merrimack River, and I'm going to show you a picture of it in just a second. This is the Lemp Mausoleum. This is where the Lemps are buried. You can see here that this is one side of the mausoleum, and basically each Lemp has their own little section. The nameplates can be removed, and then the coffins would be behind it. This is Cragwald. This is Edwin's house, and over here off the camera would be the Merrimack River. This is what it looks like from the Merrimack River looking up to the house. It looks like a little fortress more than anything else. Under the Lemp Mansion, they have a pool, or what was probably more like a spa. It was more like a heated pool where they could soak. They basically took a pipe from the Lemp Brewery and piped it all the way to the mansion and heated the water so that they had basically an underground spa. This is the Lemp Family Theater. So when a famous performer would come to St. Louis to perform, the Lemps would then hire them to do an extra show after the regular show, and that show would be down in their family theater, again, underground in the cave system. So basically, like if Beyonce were to come to St. Louis and do a show at the Enterprise Center, afterwards she would do a separate show just for the Lemps. And so they were known for having this theater with well-known acts coming into St. Louis. The cave system, known as Cherokee Caves, was open for a while to public tours, but then shut down after insurance and just safety issues couldn't be secured enough. And then that's basically it for the Lemp We will take a look at the bushes later on, but I hope you enjoyed this little story about the Lemp family.